Hey,
Cost. There's the cost of generating 1 megawatt hour of electricity is approximately 50 to $55 per megawatt hour today in 2020, and that drops by approximately 3 to 4% by 2035, despite adding so much renewables and so much batteries into the grid. And this is happening primarily because of three reasons. Reason number one is just the dramatic decline in the clean energy costs and how it is expected to continue going forward. Second, contrary to everybody's belief, the fossil fuel prices are not dropping. So you are actually avoiding a significant chunk of your costs in terms of avoiding the gas or the coal generation. Having said that, in our research, we have considered pretty conservative projection for fossil fuel prices. For example, I don't know if you follow gas prices and so on. The typical gas price in the US is about $3 to $4 per MMBTU. For the last year and a half, the gas prices have consistently been of the order of $5, $6 per MMBTU. We assume a standard $3 per MMBTU gas price. So just going with the historical trends, but even despite that, because of this steep reduction in the clean energy costs, we still find the generation costs are actually going to be lower in 2035 compared to 2020. And the third reason that we find this costs are somewhat lower, the new electricity demand that gets added is actually helpful from a renewable standpoint. So for example, the transportation, the electric vehicle demand can act as a flexible load. For example, it can shift the charging of the cars depending on when grid has the most amount of electricity without causing any level of discomfort to the vehicle owners or operators. Then the next question that comes is the grid reliable with so much renewable electricity? There's so much intermittency, so much variability into the grid. Is the grid reliable? And the short answer to that is yes. So we looked at power plant by power plant level operation of the US electricity grid for the entire year in 2035. So 8760 hours in the year, into over 14,000 power plants, into each major transmission interface, and so on. Again, I wouldn't go into the details, but the point is, we also assess several risks and the power system reliability indices and so on. But the limited point is the power system and the grid operates reliably even with so much renewables into the system. But what is interesting is that despite so much batteries and getting built, the system still needs some level of peaking support from the existing gas generators. And this is an interesting point. So existing gas generators in the US are approximately between 500 and 600. With what we find is you still need close to 300, slightly higher than 300 gigawatts of this existing gas capacity to be online in 2035, not for providing the energy, because 90% of the electricity is coming from clean sources, only 10% is coming from gas. But over these 300 to 350 gigawatts of gas capacity is needed to provide that capacity support, that peaking support. And interestingly, over 70 gigawatts of that gas capacity is dispatched for less than 1% of the time, meaning that 70 gigawatts of gas capacity is only used during those super peak periods in summer for approximately 80 to 90 hours in the entire year. So about 3 to 4 days in the year. That's when you use that capacity. And once that is used, then that capacity is never started, never used again. So you essentially use that gas capacity as a backup. And so what is interesting is, contrary to all the previous studies, we find that the gas generation doesn't have a role. So gas as a fuel doesn't have much of a role, but the gas capacity still needs to be maintained, about 300 to 350 gigawatts all the way through 2035 to provide that capacity support. And of course, it will consume some fuel, but that will be super small relative to what it could have or what it currently does. Now, this also opens up some new opportunities for demand response, especially these super peak events. So if you just reduce your demand during peak hours by 60, 70 gigawatts, then you don't even need to maintain that gas capacity and so on. But this, in one way, is also a more politically pragmatic view of looking at things. So once you maintain this 300, 350 gigawatts of gas capacity, you also maintain the operations and maintenance jobs in those gas power plants. So even if those gas power plants are not generating as much energy, you still maintain the jobs and reduce the political opposition for going towards a completely clean energy future. So from a political standpoint, this becomes a very pragmatic aspect. All right, so now let's quickly switch gears to India. So I see there are a few questions, so I think I'm just going to wrap up in the next 5 to 7 minutes, so we have plenty of time for questions and then discussion. So now in the US, the unique problem that we saw is there is already a lot of existing gas and fossil capacity, and that creates its own economic as well as political challenges for this rapid clean energy transformation. But in case of India, since the country is growing so rapidly, this issue of existing stranded assets or existing assets being stranded because of new clean energy penetration is not as high as it is in the US. It does exist, but at a much smaller scale. But what is interesting in case of India is India also has a large domestic fossil fuel industry, mainly coal industry. And over 60 to 70% of India's domestic coal is used in the power sector, for electricity generation. So the moment you start cleaning up the electricity generation, the coal consumption starts reducing. That's the conventional wisdom. But this is where India has a unique opportunity, because India is growing so rapidly. So even if India builds or India meets all the growing electricity demand with new solar, wind, and other cleaner sources, the existing coal consumption in the country, it doesn't have to reduce below the current or 2020, 2021 levels for a very long time. India is growing at a rate of close to 6 to 7% per year for electricity consumption, not GDP. Electricity demand is growing at 6 to 7%. So just in the next 15 years, India's electricity demand is going to be more than doubled. Okay, so even if all this new electricity demand is met by clean sources, the existing coal consumption and existing coal generation doesn't have to be touched. That is mostly meeting the existing demand. So this again changes the political economy, meaning that at least in the short to medium run, there is no risk to India's current coal assets and coal industry, and that changes the political economy of clean energy transformation in the country. And the good news is that the Indian government has also been very forthcoming and very aggressive and ambitious in terms of making clean energy commitments. So for example, India has committed to building nearly 500 gigawatts of non-fossil capacity by 2030. What that means is nearly 50% of India's electricity generation by 2030 will come from clean sources. which is a huge deal in India because currently coal supplies close to 80% of India's total electricity generation. So that's a big shift, particularly in a growing economy. So what we did, again, I wouldn't go into the details of the study, but a simple explanation of what we did is we asked the question of what is the least cost way of meeting India's electricity demand over the next 10 years. So this is a study that we did last year. So up to year 2030, what would be the least cost energy resource mix for meeting India's growing electricity demand? And the kind of methods that we used are very similar to what we used in the US. We looked at each and every power plant in the country, existing power plants, planned power plants, and we also looked at what would be the quote unquote optimal investment pathway. Where would those new power plants come in, or where should they be coming in? We mapped out the transmission system in India, and we did a detailed, comprehensive assessment of how Indian grid would operate in the year 2030. And this is what we found. Is by 2030, the least cost resource mix in India includes over 450 gigawatts of renewables and 250 gigawatt hours of storage. So these numbers may not mean much to you, particularly for people who do not work on India or don't have the right context. So don't sweat about the numbers, just look at the trends, okay? So the chart on the left shows the installed capacity in our least cost case in India. Okay, this is 2020, this is 2030. And chart on the right shows annual electricity generation in terawatt hours per year. Black is coal, green is wind, and yellow is solar. And what is interesting is the coal capacity by and large remains flat between 2020 and 2030, which means that India does not need to add any new coal capacity. And look at coal based electricity generation, that also by and large remains flat. There is a slight increase, like 3% increase, 4% increase, but by and large, the coal-based electricity generation is flat. And this is essentially shows the point that I was trying to make is you do not need to touch the existing coal assets in India for the next 10 to 15 years. Just focus on new build out. Do not build any new coal. So that way you can also manage the political economy of the existing coal assets. Anyway, so what we find is over 300 gigawatts of solar and over 140 gigawatts of wind capacity to be cost effective. But this capacity has to be supported with pretty significant battery storage. What we find the battery storage to be approximately 60 gigawatts, give or take 63 to be precise, or 250 gigawatt hours. Again, these numbers may not mean much, but what is interesting is, as I mentioned here, between 2020 and 2030, as the electricity demand nearly doubles, the coal generation increases only by about 8 to 10%. And by 2030, Indian grid can go to nearly 50% clean by 2030. And we are doing a study right now that shows Indian grid can go to close to 80% clean by 2035, while maintaining the existing political economy of the power sector. Similar results for China. Again, I don't want to belabor the point, but in case of China, the problems are a mix of US and India. For example, Chinese electricity demand is also growing pretty rapidly, but China has also built out a lot of the electricity infrastructure. So that's why if it goes aggressively to a clean energy future, it does risk some stranding of the existing coal capacity, and that does create some political economic challenges. But at the same time, China is growing pretty rapidly, meaning that that problem, the political economic problem of stranding, is also somewhat smaller relative to the US. And the way Chinese policy works is also very different from a market-based policy in the US or in India. So China is already making pretty aggressive commitments in the clean energy space, and not just commitments but also deployment. For example, China, as I mentioned, has already installed over 800 gigawatts of renewable capacity in the country. US has approximately 200 gigawatts of renewable capacity. India has close to 100 to 120 gigawatts of renewable capacity. China is at 800 gigawatts. So China is already ahead, but China also has a much larger electricity demand. And as I mentioned earlier, China is routinely building 120 to 130 gigawatts of new renewable capacity every year. US is installing approximately 35 to 40 gigawatts. India is installing about 20 gigawatts every year. So China is already way ahead of other countries, but they also have 1,200 gigawatts of coal-based generation that they need to take care of. So what we showed is by 2035, Chinese electricity grid can go to close to 80% clean, clean, as I mentioned, non-fossil sources. 80% energy can come from non-fossil sources in China by 2035. China already has a 2060 carbon neutrality target. So this is significantly more aggressive than what their current target is. But China is the largest emitter in the world. So if there is a case for aggressive climate mitigation policy, then it is truly China. The other conclusions from our China assessment are also pretty similar. The grid is reliable, the costs do not increase, and the overall political economy can essentially still be favorable. So let me stop here, and I'll be happy to take questions or have a broader discussion.
Thanks, Nikki. So we have a couple of questions. I'll start with the first one. How can energy models and energy cost curves of the future take into account new technologies that are currently under development, especially in developing countries? Are there some pathways that we can take to bring these technologies to the market quicker?
Again, that's a great question. So this really, this broader technology market is also pretty global. Okay, there is just no one country that is isolated unless it's North Korea. But most of the major economies, they are well integrated into the global technology market. And the prices are truly a product of scale and favorable policies. So if governments can make the right policies to offer scale to these newer emerging technologies, then the prices can come down much faster. For example, this is exactly what happened in the solar industry. So in the early 2000s, early to mid 2000s, the solar prices were pretty expensive. And that was also the time when some of the progressive countries and regions made some aggressive solar procurement policies, like California, to some extent India caught on to that bandwagon in late 2000s, but nonetheless they did, like Germany and other European economies, and that offered the scale and that brought the cost down. And this is exactly what is going on right now in batteries, and this is exactly what is going on right now in the offshore wind technology. So having said that, see, these technologies are not rocket sciences. It's really just a question of scale and the right policy framework.
Okay, great answer. Thank you. So our next question was about one of your slides. It was, what was the difference between the plot on the left and right axis I think that was towards the beginning of the presentation where you had green lines.
Right. Oh, I'm so sorry if the axis didn't have, and that was precisely the slide that I had some problem with formatting, and I mentioned that to Dhruv. That slide showed we kind of modeled several scenarios. For example, in 2035, or just in the future could take two pathways. One is we take pretty aggressive climate action, or the other, we don't do anything. And no new policies get implemented and so on. So those are the two major future pathways, and that's we created two scenarios in our analysis. One is called no new policies, and the other is a clean energy future. And the other way of looking at the future is also when you start valuing the environmental externalities, both in terms of the greenhouse gas, the climate externality, as well as the local environmental damage externality. And if you add those environmental costs, then what is true least cost, what is economically most optimal, that really changes those definitions, because the environmental cost of coal and gas and all other fossil energy use are so humongous. The moment you add those, any renewable or clean technology essentially becomes cost optimal. So those were the multiple lines in the multiple charts. I'm sorry if the numbers didn't come through. I'll be happy to share those to you separately.
Yeah, we can definitely distribute the slides after if you'd share them with us. That would be great. So the next question, China added about 250 gigawatts of energy demand just by adding a single appliance. That's a very powerful statement. As Africa and India electrify and climate change makes these regions hotter, what is the best way to deal with this exponential increase in demand?
Again, that's a great question, and this is a question that is keeping a lot of people, a lot of scientists, and a lot of policymakers busy. So on one hand, it is really scary, and to a certain extent, we are also already seeing that in Indonesia, in India, and some African countries. So there are, I would say there are three policies that can really help mitigate this to a certain extent. One is this highlights the role for the most stringent energy efficient appliance standards. So any new appliance that gets sold on the market has to be the best in the market in terms of energy efficiency. The common criticism of that, well, you know what, but these markets, particularly African market, is very price sensitive, and that's why you can't, these energy efficient air conditioners or appliances are going to be pretty expensive. You can't sell expensive appliances in these markets. But that is actually not necessarily true. So we looked at several appliances, several years, several countries. Just the cost to companies to increase the efficiency of their appliances is really small. But most of this appliance business is a high volume, low margin business. So even if the cost for the companies is really tiny, they're not going to make it because that's going to cut into their volumes. So if the governments can guarantee the volumes, then the appliance prices do not have to increase. And the only way to guarantee volumes at the national scale for any country is by tightening the minimum energy performance standards at the national scale, which is what the Department of Energy does here for us. The Bureau of Energy Efficiency does that in India. The NDRC, the National Development Reform Commission, does in China, and so on. So those standards specify what is the minimum efficiency level that is needed for appliances to be sold in this market. And that's the only policy. And there are several other policies like manufacturer incentives, like tax incentives. If you sell more efficient products, you get more tax breaks and so on. And the third is making these appliances demand responsive. So these appliances create two problems. One is they increase your energy consumption, but on the other hand, particularly appliances like air conditioners, everybody turns on their air conditioners at the same time. And so it increases your peak demand. It makes your peak demand problem even worse. So making sure these appliances can actually provide some demand response, that is also pretty important and critical.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question, in terms of financing renewable energy addition in developing countries, world leaders committed to 100 billion in funding, but we're far off. Is there anything else that can be done on a global level to channel funding into developing countries to expand their clean energy capacity?
Again, great question. You're absolutely right. $100 billion is nothing. Just to give you a scale of things, $100 billion will be enough for investing in approximately 100 to 200, at most 200 gigawatts. In reality, about 100 gigawatts of new renewable capacity. The total renewable capacity we need in the country, in the world to decarbonize is close to 8,000 gigawatts. So this is a drop in the bucket. But the good news is that because the prices have fallen so much, the help is not necessarily in terms of providing additional financing. You do need financing for particularly weaker countries, but that is not the binding constraint. The binding constraint truly is making sure there is enough demand for these technologies. And the sure shot way of creating demand is creating the right policies, like renewable portfolio standard, clean energy standard, or just making, announcing some goals, setting the goals for the country. So that is what is going to create the demand. The existing political economy and kind of broken governance structures in the utilities in emerging economies is going to prevent any aggressive action that is going to emerge organically, just because economics is favorable. Because utilities rate base their expenses, so utilities are not cost minimizers unless regulators or policymakers tell them to do so, and regulators and policymakers are not going to tell them until the political economy is aligned. So that's the place to start, rather than just offering financing. Having said that, financing becomes really critical for some of the emerging technologies like offshore wind, where enough scale has not been achieved yet, and that technology holds a lot of promise, but is not yet cost effective. So for those technologies, you do need a lot of financing help, and that's where some of this financing funding can be allocated.
Okay, thank you. We have another question on your slides. What does AG shift mean?
Sure. I mean, I'll be happy to send you that 100-page report, and would love to get your comments. The AG shift means India did a pretty innovative demand response program. They shifted the agricultural load. AG means agriculture. So they shifted the agricultural load mostly from evening or night hours to solar hours. So India has already shifted close to 10 to 15 gigawatts of agricultural load. They used to supply agricultural pumps. They actually laid out separate distribution feeder lines to supply electricity just to agricultural pumps, irrigation pumps. And they would supply, they would kind of turn those feeders on, the utilities would turn those feeders on only at night. So the farmers could use electricity only at night. So what they did is several utilities in India, they started turning those feeders on during solar hours to better integrate the solar energy that India is building. So that was that agricultural shifts context. And what we expect is that's an extremely innovative demand response program, the largest demand response program in the world right now. California boasts that we shift 3,000 megawatts or 3 gigawatts or 4 gigawatts of electricity load. India is already doing 15 gigawatts right now, and they want to take it to close to 40 to 50 gigawatts of demand response.
Okay, thank you. A lot of countries, especially India, are focusing on DER, but there's a significant barrier to DER in terms of the political economy favoring the conventional grid, even in cases where it is not so cost effective. Do you have any thoughts on this?
No, that's a great question. So I am honestly speaking, I'm going to split on DER. See, on one hand, from purely from a cost perspective, there are only a few specific applications and regions where distributed resources would actually be cheaper than utility scale resources. The utility scale resources are so far out, the transmission costs are so high that you are just better off building your distributed resource. But for most cases, the utility scale resources are actually cheaper. Having said that, utility scale resources also imply making new transmission investments. So while on paper, transmission investments may be cheaper, but actually getting a transmission line built, particularly in the US, yeah, I mean, good luck with that. We'll meet after 10 years. So that creates a lot of transaction costs and other institutional barriers. And distributed resources could be a great way to overcome those barriers. So I think that should definitely be looked into, assessing the true value of distributed resources to them. For example, once you have a lot of electric vehicle load, a lot of other new loads coming in, distributed resources can provide some interesting value streams. But in India, though, unfortunately, just the quality of distributed resources, it's so poor, mainly because of three reasons. Number one is just the bad air quality in the cities that severely hampers the solar capacity factors. Second is a fairly stubborn and broken down utilities, and they are dead against distributed resources. So expanding distributed resources really implies taking the utilities head on, which should be done if it makes sense. But the cost differential is so small that it may not be worth taking on the utilities head on. And third is because in India, it's mostly multi-story buildings, the roof space is pretty limited. There are multiple uses of the roof. So just the DER potential to begin with is much smaller. There are trees covering, there is always dust that covers the solar panels. So the economics is not as favorable as it is here.
Okay, thank you. We have 2 more minutes and 1 more question, so this is perfect. The report on least cost pathways for India looks great. However, electricity generation mix in reality does not always follow the least cost pathways, given that decisions on type and location of capacity will be shaped by other decision criteria in addition to cost. In what ways can we account for them in our models, or is that something you have already accounted for in your model?
Again, great question. So no utility, I mean, nowhere in the world just follows the least cost pathway. It is always a political economic least cost. It is always just an economic least cost. So no, we have not explicitly factored in these other non-economic factors. But what is interesting is, this clean energy investments also offer some significant political advantages. So gas or coal or other investments are limited by limited by several factors. You need water, you need to have access to the gas pipeline, and so on. If not, then you need to build a new gas pipeline, and that is just extremely expensive and so on. But for solar particularly, and particularly in India, the solar resource quality utility scale is good, no matter where you are in the country. I mean, it is obviously, there are some better resource quality areas, there are some not so good resource quality areas, but on average, it is pretty good. It's a very sunny country. So that's why for politicians, you can actually have a solar investment in your district without compromising a lot on the resource quality, on the economics. So that actually favors this rapid clean energy deployment, and favors the political economy towards clean energy. And second, well, unlike coal or gas, where there is a lot of fuel expenses, all the expenses for solar or wind are one time. It's just capital investment. So which is also works great from a campaign finance point of view, where instead of making those expenses over multiple years, a developer is going to put in $1 billion right in one instance, which which can be used for financing the campaigns. So that way, political economy is better aligned, and that could actually be, that could better facilitate the rapid deployment.
Okay, perfect timing. And thank you for answering all of our questions, Nikki. We really appreciate it. And thank you for giving us an hour of your time today. So some people are signing off, but before we go, I just wanted to remind everyone to sign up for our email list so that you can get notified about our following seminars. We'll be talking about retiring and repurposing coal plants, barriers and solution to universal energy access, and barriers to at-scale deployment of green energy technologies. And lastly, a talk on exploring air pollution. So again, thank you, Nikki, and thanks everyone for joining, and hope you have a great day.
All right, thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.